Donald Trump and his erratic behavior could be leading the United States towards World War III.
We're talking about annihilating millions of people. Yeah.
If this border wall happens, it will be an unprecedented environmental catastrophe.
We can't begin to normalize this. This is dangerous. This is childish. This is unpresidential.
This is it, the end of the presidential race, and it feels like the end of the world.
Therapists have now coined a phrase called Trump anxiety disorder. And after hearing from an increasing number of patients who name President Donald Trump and his volatility as part of their issue, it's now become, believe it or not, it's become a thing. And in studio tonight, we have Mila Golovine and Ahmed Abdul, I'm going to get this right, Abdulmajeed. To talk about this very thing. So, Abdul, real quick, your background's actually quite fascinating. You were the head resident at a hospital in your country, came here and gave all that up to start all over, and here you are. What's your initial thoughts on all this as an outsider, coming into this country as an immigrant and watching what's going on?
Yes, so as you said, I was chief resident of a cardiovascular hospital in Iraq, and I was chief resident during the civil war in Iraq, which I got to experience what we call like a first-hand trauma. And through that, because of the repeated traumas, I even ended up having to flee the country, and I went to Jordan, the neighboring country, and I stayed there for 2.5 years as a refugee. So like one day I'm a chief of residence, a prodigy cardiovascular surgeon, and then the next day I'm a refugee. Definitely a different life, and I had to adjust for a lot of variables, and one of them was the loss of status, and also the finance was much different as a refugee and compared to being a doctor.
I can imagine.
Yes.
Well, what happened at that moment? I mean, one day you're getting up, you're going to work, you're the head of cardiovascular surgery at a prestigious hospital. What happened that the next day you wake up and now you're a refugee?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, so when you are in Iraq, you get used to a lot of external trauma to the point that you start creating this shield that kind of protects you, emotional shield that tries to protect you from repeated experiences of like extreme emotions. And it's useful when you're going through things like war. Mm-hmm. But also the side effect is that at the same time it shields you from feeling joy and happiness, like good things that you would want to experience, the extremes of it. So that is what you realize when you leave the country. And eventually, even though that I was a refugee and I had to experience a loss of, my goals and my purpose and the things that I work for, like being a chief of residence in a surgical hospital, to the second day I'm a refugee. So you experience a lot of loss, but at the same time, I was shedding that shield little by little because I was for the first time in a safe environment. So these are the first things you start feeling everything that you felt before as a surgeon, as a doctor in Iraq. And then you start feeling all of these emotions, and they come as triggers. Like the first time you hear a big noise that is not an explosion, like an explosion, yeah. So, because every noise in Iraq, like a loud noise, you immediately assume it's a bullet, it's an explosion, and then all of a sudden you don't have to worry about these things.
So now, you came to the U.S. as a refugee.
Yes.
And so where are you now?
So I came to Michigan as a refugee, spent 2 years and couldn't get over the cold.
No, hey, you know what? Anybody that lives in Michigan, still not over the cold.
Yeah, so I couldn't. I accepted an offer for a cancer center in Houston for a full-time job, and I moved to Houston in 2014. And after 2 years of successfully working as a medical interpreter in a cancer hospital, I got offered to join Master Word Services, which I currently work with as a language access advisor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
interesting. So now here's Mila, you're a founder of Master Word Services, and you're from Russia originally.
Yes.
Yeah. So you have an outsider's view to this as well, particularly with what's going on with Donald Trump, and of course this whole issue with Trump and the whole Russian investigation, the Russian connection. What are your, when you look at this from the outside in? I mean, what's your feeling on this?
My feeling is a very high stress as well, but coming from a different perspective, because having grown up in Russia, I have vicarious trauma associated with what happens in Russia. Mm-hmm. And so I have very strong emotions about this as well.
Well, again, I think that's an interesting question. Having grown up in Russia, I mean, when people in the when you deal with people in the U.S., I mean, obviously a lot of people haven't traveled to Russia; they've never been there. I've been fortunate; I've lived in a variety of countries all around the world in my life, so I've had real experience in different countries. So when people talk about things like, "Oh, socialism's great," I can tell you firsthand, no, it's not, because I've been there, I've seen it at work, and I've seen what happens on the other end of that. But when you talk to people that have, opinions about Russia and what's happening, do you see a lot of errors in the things that they're saying or thinking that are not really what it's like in Russia? Do they have a different perspective, should I say?
Well, sorry about that.
Sorry.
There are, of course, everybody has a different opinion and a different perspective. And one thing is when people either put a certain system completely down, saying it's terrible, or another thing when they build it up and saying socialism is fantastic. We can look at Venezuela and what happened in Venezuela, and that's one of the results of that. But I think looking at all of this can cause somebody tremendous amount of stress. Mm-hmm.
Well, so and that's really kind of where we wanted to get to here. I have this clip talking about this. This was from CBC, Canadian news outlets, and they're reporting on this surge in this diagnosis about the Trump anxiety disorder.
Therapists say that there has been a rise in politically related anxiety dubbed Trump anxiety disorder. The main symptom, fearing that the world is ending. Many on the left reportedly feeling on edge about President Trump's rhetoric and policies. Although it is not an official diagnosis, patients also suffering from lack of sleep and spending an excessive amount of time on social media.
Well, I think the last part is people spending an excessive amount of time on social media. That was happening before Trump anyway. So
it's a pre-existing condition.
Exactly. But this is kind of an interesting diagnosis because, one thing that we have seen really ever since the run up to the election and then since the election, and again going to the Russian investigation and to the dossier, all the way to the social media aspect of this kind of this uncivil civil war that we're fighting right now. There's this ongoing battle between technically the right and the left over these ideologies. How does somebody, and for me, we had this great conversation yesterday just talking about how we're just getting sick and tired of all the fighting. It's just, look, I just want to live my life. And I think most Americans are this way. They just want to kind of be left alone. They want to raise their kids and they want to be happy. I mean, functionally, I think that's how most people are. But it seems like we're just inundated with, no matter what channel you turn on, whether it's Fox or CNN, it doesn't matter. Whichever channel you turn it on, you're just getting inundated with all this negativity. Ahmed, what are some ways that we need to start thinking about how we deal with this? Or is that a better question for Mila?
I think it's a better question for Mila.
Well, one of the ways we have been dealing a lot with vicarious trauma because as interpreters, and we do a lot of work with interpreters experience vicarious trauma by witnessing the stress of the people they're working with. Whether it's a person who is getting a end-of-life diagnosis at the hospital or it's working with a victim of sexual abuse. So one of the ways that you can deal with that high level of stress and trauma, one of the first things that you can do is just by naming the emotion that you're experiencing. If you simply name the emotion that you're experiencing, you are moving the process of stress from experiencing it in the back of your head, and Ahmed, correct me, I'm not a doctor, in the amygdala, to the frontal cortex, and just that fact alone helps you reduce the stress.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we're going to go back and talk some more about how to deal with vicarious trauma and what it means, and of course, where we go to from here. We'll be right back. I'm your host, Lance Roberts, on the Lance Roberts Show. Don't go away.
Want a longer talk with Lance about your money? Request a personal one-on-one at lancerobertshow.com.